Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, watching the Pacific dawn break across waters that would soon run red with blood and black with oil. The date was June 4th, 1942, and the most elite naval strike force in Japanese history was steaming toward what its commanders believed would be their greatest triumph. Instead, they sailed unknowingly toward catastrophe. The morning air hummed with tension as flight deck crews prepared for what they assumed would be another devastating blow against American forces. 6 months had passed since Pearl Harbor, and Japanese naval aviation had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable typhoon. Wake Island, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, all had fallen before the might of the combined fleet's carrier divisions. Now, Midway Atoll lay ahead, a tiny speck of coral and sand that would serve as the bait for a trap designed to crush the remaining American Pacific Fleet. Nagumo commanded the heart of Japanese naval power, 4 fleet carriers packed with veteran pilots who had honed their skills in the crucible of combat. The Akagi, his flagship, led the formation alongside her sister ships Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These floating fortresses carried over 270 of Japan's finest aircraft, piloted by men who considered themselves invincible. Behind them sailed battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, a armada that had never known defeat. The plan appeared flawless in its conception. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor and mastermind of Japanese naval strategy, had crafted an elaborate deception designed to lure the American fleet into a decisive battle. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands would draw American attention northward while the main force struck Midway. Once the atoll fell, American forces would rush to retake it, sailing directly into the jaws of the combined fleet's superior firepower. What the Japanese did not know was that American cryptographers had penetrated their naval codes. Deep in the basement of Pearl Harbor, teams of intelligence officers had been reading Japanese communications for weeks, unraveling the complex web of Yamamoto's strategy piece by piece. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters in Hawaii, knew exactly where and when the Japanese would strike. As Nagumo's carriers cut through the swells, their wakes spreading like silver ribbons behind them, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton was briefing Nimitz on the enemy's precise positions and intentions. The Americans had positioned their own carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, northeast of Midway, waiting in ambush. Task Force 16, under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, and Task Force 17, under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, prepared to spring their own trap. According to naval historian Gordon Prang's definitive account, Miracle at Midway, the Japanese force represented the cream of their naval aviation, with pilot training standards that would never again be matched during the war. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last wisps of dawn mist from the carrier decks. On Akagi's flight deck, mechanics made final adjustments to Nakajima fighters and Aichi dive bombers while pilots gathered for their briefings. They joked and laughed with the casual confidence of men who had never tasted defeat, unaware that American radar operators on Midway had already detected their approach. The first Japanese strike launched at 4:30 in the morning, 108 aircraft rising from the carrier decks like deadly hornets. Their target was Midway's airfield and defensive installations, which they would soften up before the main invasion force arrived. As the formation disappeared toward the southern horizon, Nagumo retained roughly half his aircraft aboard the carriers, armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for the expected engagement with American naval forces. The stage was set for one of history's most decisive naval battles. In less than 6 hours, the course of the Pacific War would be determined by the skill, courage, and luck of pilots who would fight and die above waters that had never witnessed such carnage. The Japanese sailed toward their rendezvous with destiny, confident in their superiority and blind to the trap that awaited them. At 6:16 on the morning of June 4, 1942, the serenity of Midway Atoll shattered under the thunder of Japanese bombs. Lieutenant Colonel Ira Kimmys, commanding Midway's Marine air defenses, watched from his command bunker as enemy aircraft swept over the tiny islands like a plague of mechanical locusts. The first phase of Admiral Yamamoto's grand strategy had begun, but it would not unfold as planned. The Japanese strike, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, found Midway's defenders ready for battle. American radar had provided 20 minutes of warning, enough time to scramble every available fighter and evacuate most ground personnel to protective shelters. 26 obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters and newer Grumman Wildcat interceptors rose to meet the attacking force, their engines screaming defiance as they climbed toward the enemy formation. The air battle above Midway was brief and brutal. Japanese Zero fighters, piloted by veterans of countless Pacific engagements, carved through the American defensive formation with surgical precision. Major Floyd Parks, leading the Marine fighters, pressed his attack with desperate courage, knowing his outclassed aircraft stood little chance against the superior enemy fighters. One by one, American planes fell burning into the sea or crashed onto Midway's coral beaches. Despite the fierce resistance, Tominaga's bombers found their targets. The airfield disappeared under clouds of smoke and coral dust as bombs tore apart runways, fuel dumps, and aircraft hangars. The power station vanished in a thunderous explosion that rattled windows across the atoll. Yet Midway's defenders had extracted a price for this punishment. Several Japanese aircraft fell to ground fire, and the surviving Marine pilots, their numbers decimated but their spirit unbroken. Most critically for Japanese plans, Tominaga radioed back to Admiral Nagamo at 7 o'clock that morning. There is need for a second attack wave. The airfield remained operational despite the bombing, and American resistance appeared stronger than anticipated. This single message would prove to be one of the most consequential radio transmissions in naval history. Aboard the Akagi, Nagumo faced his first crucial decision of the day. His remaining strike aircraft stood ready on the flight decks, armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes specifically intended for attacking American warships. Intelligence suggested enemy naval forces were somewhere in the area, but their exact location remained unknown. Should he launch immediately against the suspected American fleet, or rearm his aircraft for a second strike against Midway? The decision seemed obvious. Midway must be neutralized before the invasion could proceed. At 7:15, Nagumo issued the fateful order to rearm his attack planes with high-explosive bombs for ground targets. Across 4 carrier decks, ordnance crews began the laborious process of switching weapons, moving armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes to storage areas, and bringing up high-explosive ordnance. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to the Japanese, American scout planes had located the enemy fleet. At 5:52 that morning, Ensign Jack Reed, piloting a PBY Catalina flying boat from Midway, had spotted smoke on the northwestern horizon. His subsequent radio report, enemy carriers bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles, electrified American commanders throughout the Pacific. Naval records from the National Archives indicate that this sighting report reached Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor within minutes, confirming that American intelligence estimates had been accurate. Admiral Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from the carrier Enterprise, received Reed's report while his ships maneuvered northeast of Midway. The moment he had been waiting for had arrived. At 6:07 that morning, he turned his carriers into the wind and began launching the largest carrier strike in American naval history. From Enterprise and Hornet, squadrons of Dauntless dive bombers, Devastator torpedo planes, and Wildcat fighters rose into the morning sky. As American strike aircraft formed up and headed toward their targets, both fleets raced toward a collision that would reshape the Pacific War. The Japanese, confident in their superiority and focused on their ground attack mission, remained unaware that American carriers were closing for the kill. In less than 2 hours, the skies above the Japanese fleet would erupt in violence that would send 4 proud carriers to the bottom of the Pacific. At 9:20 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led his torpedo squadron toward certain death. Flying obsolete Douglas Devastator aircraft that were slow, poorly armed, and vulnerable to fighter attack, Torpedo 8 from the carrier Hornet had become separated from their escorting fighters in the confusion of the morning launch. Now they approached the Japanese fleet alone, 15 aircraft against the most formidable naval force in the Pacific. Waldron, a part Cherokee pilot known for his aggressive tactics and devotion to his men, had trained his squadron relentlessly for this moment. He had drilled them in low-level attacks against heavily defended targets, knowing that torpedo planes would have to fly straight and level during their final attack runs, presenting perfect targets for enemy gunners. As the Japanese carriers appeared through the morning haze, growing larger with each passing second, Waldron keyed his radio one final time. "Watch those fighters! See that splash? We got a hit! Attack immediately!" The sky above Admiral Nagumo's task force erupted in deadly chaos. Japanese combat air patrol fighters, flying the feared Mitsubishi Zero, dove from altitude like hawks striking prey. The Devastators, lumbering along at barely 120 miles per hour, could neither outrun nor outmaneuver their attackers. One by one, American aircraft burst into flames or cartwheeled into the Pacific, their crews dying in the service of a desperate mission that seemed doomed from the start. Ensign George Gay, the youngest pilot in Torpedo 8, watched his squadron mates fall around him as he pressed his attack against the carrier Soryu. Zeros swarmed his aircraft like angry wasps, their 20mm cannon shells tearing chunks from his wings and fuselage. His gunner, Arm First Class Bob Huntington, fired back desperately before slumping forward in his cockpit, mortally wounded. Gay's torpedo finally dropped, running true toward the enemy carrier before passing harmlessly beneath her hull, another miss in what was becoming a catalog of failures. Seconds later, Gay's own aircraft shuddered under the impact of cannon shells and plunged toward the sea. He survived the crash, floating in his life jacket among the debris of his squadron, while Zero fighters strafed the water around him. From his position in the Pacific swells, Gay would become the sole witness to the climactic events that followed, watching as American dive bombers arrived to exact terrible revenge for Torpedo 8's sacrifice. The ordeal of the torpedo planes was not limited to Waldron's squadron. Torpedo 6 from Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, and Torpedo 3 from Yorktown under Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, met similar fates as they pressed home their attacks against the Japanese carriers. Flying in piecemeal fashion due to navigation errors and communication failures, the American torpedo squadrons arrived over the enemy fleet at different times, allowing Japanese defenders to concentrate their fire on each group in turn. According to Samuel Eliot Morrison's official naval history, The Two-Ocean War, the torpedo plane attacks, while tactically unsuccessful, served a crucial strategic purpose by drawing Japanese fighters down to sea level and disrupting the enemy's defensive coordination. The statistics of the torpedo plane attacks were grimmer than any American naval aviator could have imagined. Of 41 Devastators launched that morning, only 6 would return to their carriers. Torpedo 8 was completely annihilated except for Gay's miraculous survival. The other squadrons fared little better, with veteran pilots and air crew who had trained for years disappearing in moments of fire and steel. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain. As Japanese fighters dove to sea level to intercept the low-flying torpedo planes, and as carrier air groups maneuvered frantically to avoid the American attacks, Admiral Nagumo's task force found itself scattered and disorganized. More critically, the timing of the torpedo attacks had caught the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment, with their flight decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed for the anticipated second strike against Midway. High above the carnage, invisible to the Japanese pilots engaged in slaughtering the torpedo planes, American dive bombers were beginning their descent toward targets that could not have been more perfectly arranged for destruction. At 10:22 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey pushed his Douglas Dauntless dive bomber into a near-vertical dive toward the Japanese carrier Kaga. 2 miles below, the enemy flight deck appeared as a perfect rectangle surrounded by the white foam of her wake. For McCluskey, leading Enterprise's Bombing 6 Squadron, this moment represented the culmination of a morning filled with navigation errors, fuel shortages, and desperate searches across empty ocean. Now, finally, he had found his targets. The Japanese carriers lay spread across the Pacific like sitting ducks, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being hastily prepared for a strike against American forces. Bombs, torpedoes, and fuel hoses cluttered the decks, while ground crews worked frantically to complete the rearming process that Admiral Nagumo had ordered hours earlier. The timing could not have been more perfect for the American attack or more catastrophic for the Japanese defenders. McCluskey's first section dove toward Kaga, while Lieutenant Richard Best led his aircraft against the flagship Akagi. The Japanese carriers, caught completely by surprise, erupted in desperate defensive fire as their gunners swung weapons skyward to engage the plunging dive bombers. Tracer rounds and anti-aircraft shells filled the air like deadly fireworks, but the American pilots pressed their attacks with grim determination. Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck Akagi just aft of her island superstructure, penetrating the flight deck and exploding among aircraft being fueled for launch. The detonation triggered a chain reaction of secondary explosions as aviation gasoline ignited and spread across the hangar deck like liquid fire. Within minutes, Admiral Nagumo's proud flagship had become an inferno from which there would be no recovery. Combat records, maintained by the Naval History and Heritage Command document that the attack on Akagi began at exactly 10:26 a.m., marking the start of what historians would later call the fatal 5 minutes. Simultaneously, other sections of American dive bombers found their targets with devastating accuracy. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, leading Bombing 3 from the carrier Yorktown, brought his squadron down on the carrier Soryu in perfect formation. Multiple bomb hits transformed the Japanese carrier into a floating volcano as her own ordnance cooked off in sympathetic detonations that could be heard 20 miles away. The carrier Kaga, target of McCluskey's attack, suffered perhaps the worst fate of all. 4 direct hits in rapid succession turned her flight deck into a crater-pocked wasteland, while fires raged through her hull. Captain Jisaku Okada, commanding the great carrier, watched helplessly as his ship died around him. The veterans who had launched from Kaga's deck that very morning to bomb Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier would never return to their floating home. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Admiral Nagumo's 4 fleet carriers had been transformed from the pride of the Imperial Navy into burning wrecks. The attack had caught the Japanese at precisely the wrong moment. Their fighters were at sea level pursuing American torpedo planes. Their decks were crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, and their damage control parties were dispersed throughout the ships handling routine operations. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the pilot who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and who now lay wounded in Akagi's sick bay, would later write that he felt the ship shudder under the impact of American bombs and knew instantly that the tide of war had turned. The same carriers that had brought devastation to Pearl Harbor were now experiencing their own apocalypse under the clear Pacific sky. Captain Ryusaku Yanagamoto of the Soryu, faced with uncontrollable fires and exploding ammunition, gave the order to abandon ship. Across the task force, similar scenes played out as proud vessels that had never known defeat began their final journeys to the ocean floor. The cream of Japanese naval aviation, pilots and aircraft that represented years of training and development, perished in the flames of their burning carriers. Yet one Japanese carrier remained operational, and her captain was preparing a counterstrike that would demonstrate that the battle for Midway was far from over. As smoke columns rose from 3 burning Japanese carriers, Captain Tomeo Kaku aboard the carrier Hiryu prepared for what he knew would be his ship's final battle. The morning of June 4, 1942, had witnessed the destruction of Japan's most elite naval force, but Hiryu had escaped the initial American dive-bombing attack by operating independently of the main formation. Now she stood alone against the entire American Pacific Fleet, her crew determined to extract whatever revenge they could before joining their sister ships in death. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the first counterstrike from Hiryu's deck, 18 Aichi dive bombers escorted by 6 Zero fighters climbing into the afternoon sky. Their target was the American carrier Yorktown, identified by Japanese scouts as the flagship of the enemy force. For Kobayashi and his pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, this mission represented more than tactical necessity. It was a matter of honor, a chance to prove that Japanese naval aviation could still strike back even in the face of catastrophic defeat. The attack on Yorktown unfolded with the precision that had made Japanese carrier aviation the terror of the Pacific. Kobayashi's dive bombers penetrated the American combat air patrol and defensive anti-aircraft fire, scoring 3 direct hits on the carrier's flight deck. The explosions killed or wounded dozens of sailors and started fires that threatened to consume the ship. But Yorktown's damage control parties, trained to a standard that rivaled even the Japanese, battled the blazes with desperate efficiency. Commander Clarence Aldrich, Yorktown's damage control officer, organized firefighting efforts that saved the ship from the fate that had befallen the Japanese carriers. Within an hour, the fires were under control and Yorktown was recovering aircraft, her flight deck patched with steel plates welded directly over bomb damage. To Japanese observers, the American carrier appeared operational, though she had in fact suffered severe internal damage that would prove critical in the hours to come. Undeterred by the apparent failure of his first strike, Captain Kaku launched a second attack from Hiryu at 2:30 that afternoon. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same pilot who had led the morning attack on Midway, volunteered to lead this final mission despite flying an aircraft with a damaged fuel tank that made his return unlikely. 10 torpedo planes and 6 fighters rose from Hiryu's deck, carrying the hopes and fury of the surviving Japanese naval aviators. According to Japanese naval records archived at the National Institute for Defense Studies in Tokyo, Tomonaga's decision to lead the second strike despite his aircraft's damage exemplified the warrior spirit that had driven Japanese aviation to early war successes. Tomonaga's attack achieved what the first strike had not: 2 torpedo hits that broke Yorktown's back and left her dead in the water, listing heavily to port and unable to launch or recover aircraft. The American carrier that had survived the Battle of the Coral Sea and rushed to Midway with hasty repairs now appeared doomed, her crew beginning evacuation procedures as the list increased and internal flooding spread through her compartments. Admiral Fletcher, commanding Task Force 17 from Yorktown, transferred his flag to the cruiser Astoria and continued directing operations even as his flagship slowly capsized. The loss of Yorktown was a grievous blow to American forces, but it would not alter the outcome of the battle. Even as Japanese pilots celebrated their success, American dive bombers were already airborne, hunting for the last operational enemy carrier. Captain Kaku knew his ship's fate was sealed when reconnaissance aircraft reported American dive bombers approaching from the northeast. Hiryu had expended most of her aircraft in the 2 strikes against Yorktown, leaving her with minimal defensive capability. As the American formation appeared overhead, Kaku ordered his remaining fighters into the air for one final interception attempt. The end came swiftly for the last of Admiral Nagumo's carriers. Multiple bomb hits from Enterprise's dive bombers started uncontrollable fires throughout Hiryu's structure, condemning her to the same fate that had claimed Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. By evening, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers would be settling into the Pacific depths, taking with them Japan's capacity for offensive carrier operations and any hope of victory in the Pacific War. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the light cruiser Nagara, watching the funeral pyres of his fleet burn against the darkening Pacific sky. The evening of June 4, 1942, found the architect of Pearl Harbor's triumph transformed into the architect of Japan's greatest naval defeat. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, lay burning or already beneath the waves, taking with them not just ships and aircraft, but the very foundation of Japanese naval supremacy. The transfer from his flagship Akagi to the cruiser had been a humiliating necessity as fires consumed the great carrier throughout the afternoon. Nagumo had watched helplessly as his staff gathered what intelligence materials they could save before abandoning the ship that had carried them to victory across the Pacific. The admiral, who had commanded the most powerful naval strike force in history, now found himself reduced to observing the destruction of everything he had built. Captain Taijiro Aoki, commanding the destroyer Arashi, received orders that no Japanese naval officer ever wanted to hear. Prepare to torpedo the burning Akagi to prevent her capture by American forces. The flagship that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, that had swept British naval power from the Indian Ocean, would die by Japanese weapons rather than fall into enemy hands. Similar orders went out to other destroyers as 3 more carriers joined the funeral procession toward the ocean floor. The human cost of the disaster weighed heavily on Nagumo's conscience, as casualty reports filtered in throughout the evening. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and aviators had perished in the space of a few hours, many of them veterans whose skills and experience could never be replaced. Among the dead were pilots who had trained for years to achieve the precision that had made Japanese carrier aviation legendary. Men whose loss would cripple Japanese offensive capability for the remainder of the war. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the Pearl Harbor strike leader who had been aboard Akagi during the attack, survived the carrier's destruction only through fortune and the dedication of his shipmates. Wounded and unable to walk, Fuchida had been carried from the burning ship by sailors who refused to abandon their famous air group commander. His survival would allow him to bear witness to the magnitude of the defeat and its implications for Japan's future. Fuchida's post-war memoir, Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan, provides first-hand testimony to the confusion and despair that gripped Japanese naval leadership as the scope of their losses became clear. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from his flagship Yamato far to the west of the battle area, received reports of the disaster with growing disbelief and rage. The architect of Japanese naval strategy had staked everything on the Midway operation, convinced that a decisive victory would force America to negotiate a favorable peace. Instead, his carefully crafted plan had delivered Japan's naval aviation into the hands of an enemy who had proven far more capable and determined than anticipated. The irony was not lost on senior Japanese officers that their defeat had come at the hands of American pilots flying aircraft that were, in many cases, inferior to Japanese equipment. The Douglas Dauntless dive bombers that had destroyed 4 carriers were slower and less maneuverable than their Japanese counterparts, yet they had achieved devastating accuracy when it mattered most. American determination and training had overcome technological disadvantages through superior tactics and timing. As night fell over the Pacific battlefield, the magnitude of the disaster became clear to Japanese commanders. Not only had they lost 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers and most of their experienced pilots, but the planned invasion of Midway had become impossible. The transports carrying invasion troops were already turning back toward Japan, their mission canceled by the destruction of the naval force that was supposed to support them. Nagumo faced the prospect of reporting to Emperor Hirohito that the fleet which had brought glory to Japan at Pearl Harbor had been annihilated in a single day. The admiral who had once commanded the respect and fear of every naval officer in the Pacific now contemplated the traditional response to such overwhelming failure, ritual suicide to atone for his defeat. The Battle of Midway was effectively over, but its consequences would echo through the remaining years of the Pacific War. Dawn on June 5, 1942, broke over a Pacific Ocean transformed by 24 hours of unprecedented naval combat. The waters around Midway Atoll, which had witnessed the destruction of 4 Japanese fleet carriers and the apparent doom of the American carrier Yorktown, now served as a graveyard for the dreams and ambitions of the Japanese Empire. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reading battle reports at his Pearl Harbor headquarters, understood that the tide of the Pacific War had irrevocably turned. The statistical reality of Japan's losses defied comprehension. In a single day, Admiral Nagumo's mobile force had lost not just 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers, but 322 aircraft and over 3,000 trained personnel. More critically, Japan had lost the core of her naval aviation expertise, pilots, mechanics, and aircrew who represented years of intensive training and combat experience. The Imperial Navy's capacity for offensive carrier operations had been shattered beyond hope of quick recovery. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, commanding the abandoned Yorktown, watched from the destroyer Hammond as salvage crews attempted to save his battered carrier. The ship that Japanese pilots had reported sunk now floated stubbornly, her list stabilized by damage control efforts that had prevented complete capsizing. American determination to save Yorktown demonstrated the fundamental difference in naval philosophy that had shaped the battle's outcome. While Japanese doctrine emphasized attack at any cost, American emphasis on damage control and crew survival had proven decisive. The tragic irony of Yorktown's fate unfolded on June 6th, when Commander Yahachi Tanabe's submarine, I-168, penetrated the destroyer screen around the crippled carrier. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's hull, while a third hit the destroyer Hammond, which had been providing power and damage control assistance. The explosion broke Hammond's back, killing 81 sailors in the destroyer's final moments, while Yorktown finally succumbed to her accumulated damage and slipped beneath the Pacific swells. Yet even Yorktown's loss could not diminish the magnitude of American victory at Midway. The battle had demonstrated that Japanese naval aviation, despite its early war dominance, was not invincible when faced with determined opposition and superior intelligence. American codebreakers had provided Admiral Nimitz with precise knowledge of enemy intentions, while improved tactics and training had enabled American pilots to achieve devastating effectiveness against supposedly superior opponents. The definitive analysis of Midway's strategic impact, found in Ronald Spector's Eagle Against the Sun, concludes that the battle marked the end of Japanese offensive capability in the Pacific and the beginning of American naval dominance that would last for the remainder of the war. Admiral Yamamoto, contemplating his shattered fleet from the bridge of the super battleship Yamato, recognized that his carefully crafted strategy for ending the Pacific War through decisive battle had backfired catastrophically. Instead of destroying American naval power and forcing a negotiated peace, the Midway operation had handed the initiative to his enemies while crippling Japan's capacity to conduct offensive operations. The combined fleet that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months now faced the prospect of fighting a defensive war against increasingly powerful American forces. The human dimension of victory and defeat played out in countless individual dramas across the Pacific battlefield. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo 8, was rescued after 30 hours in the water, his testimony providing crucial intelligence about Japanese defensive tactics. Commander Wade McCluskey, whose navigation had located the Japanese fleet at the critical moment, received the Navy Cross for his role in the victory. Captain Richard Fleming, leading Marine dive bombers from Midway, died in his burning aircraft after scoring hits on the heavy cruiser Mikuma, adding his name to the roll of heroes who had secured American triumph. For Japan, the Battle of Midway represented more than military defeat. It marked the end of the nation's brief period as the dominant naval power in the Pacific. The carriers that burned at Midway had been the instruments of Japanese expansion from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. Their destruction left Japan with limited offensive capability and facing an American industrial machine that would soon be producing more aircraft carriers in a single year than Japan could build during the entire war. The violent storm of bombs and burning oil that had consumed Japan's fleet at Midway on June 4, 1942, had indeed brought ruin to the empire's naval ambitions, ensuring that the Pacific War would end not with Japanese victory, but with total American triumph over the forces that had once seemed invincible.